what are you doing here today? And the fact is, what are you doing here at all? In 1830s, close your eyes, think back, the buildings are gone, the streets are gone, the power's gone. You're sitting here in the middle of a little grove of trees. Indian creeks over several blocks, in this case miles, about a third of a mile. And you have come out here to settle this area. Now, Charles Sutton was not just a man that picked up and decided, I'm not having a good time in Boston, I'm going to leave and I'm going to come here. Charles Sutton had worked for the Vice President of the United States, which in doing research, it was John Calhoun. And the president was John Quincy Adams. So he had a background in government, and he knew how to get things done in government. And we really saw that as he went through the process of helping set up Earlville. So he came here, found the bend of the river, and he had two brother-in-laws with him. They were the McDowells. He came in through Chicago, which was obviously, we all know, was a swamp-infested swamp, and headed to the west. When he got to the first settler, it was Mr. Napier. If I can find my page, I'll even tell you more about it. Well, in any case, I'll go from memory. He headed west and went to Mr. Napier's settlement. He had a double-wide cabin, and Mr. Napier obviously was the settler of what is now Naperville. He talked with the Napiers and said, listen, this is what we're doing. Any suggestions as to where we can find a grove of trees, uninhabited, open for staking a claim? And with that, they left Napier and went on to Mr. Wilson's, which was west of there, talked with him, and Wilson's ended up being in the town of Oswego. After leaving Oswego, he went from there to another town, or another settlement, and it turned out that that was where Yorkville was. At that point, he headed north, and there were two large groves of trees, both located just north of us. One is where Shatta was located, and the other was Pawpaw Grove. Now, both of these had Indians that lived there, and this obviously was not what he was looking for. He didn't want any population where he was going to settle, wanted his own community where he could come in and set up a community. So he followed the big Indian down this way, and he ended up at a junction not a junction, but where it started to curve down here at the end of Brown Street. And Brown Street was the area that he crossed the creek, came over to about where we are, went south, crossed the little tributary that we now call Sutton's Run, and found the big bend of the Indian River that heads east. Yeah, if you want to catch up the photos, I'd appreciate it, because I'm in my mind rather than on my paper. So they looked at the area, and the area was what they wanted. If you were he, what would you want for a piece of land to populate? Anybody?
Water.
Water. You want water? What else do you want? Can't hear it.
Fertile land.
Fertile land, yes. Another thing.
Trees for firewood.
Trees. Trees not only for firewood, but for building and for fences, and certainly for heat. You cannot imagine what it must have been like here in that first winter. they staked their claim and immediately went down to where the Halls had their massacre. It was now occupied by a Martin, and stayed overnight there, and then went on to Ottawa and back down to Boston. He returned in October of 1834, and at that point he had his wife and his daughter, blanking out on her name, doesn't matter, with him. With him also were the Dow brothers, again, relatives of the wife, and some other family members that were involved with his family, either married in or otherwise. That first winter had to be, can't imagine, because if he did not have somebody left here to build a cabin for him, and he got in there here in October, well, you know what happens, can happen in October, November. You don't get a cabin up, you're going to get really cold that winter. They survived, and at that point, I would like to go through the people that came here with him during the first, say, 10 years, and what their situation was. One of the things I would like to talk about is I said that they pounded their stakes into the ground and set their claim. There are different relatively merits to a claim. Your first claim can be stick a stake in the ground and you leave. You've got a claim on that ground. A better claim is you stick a stake in the ground and you've got some improvement on the ground. The third claim that's better is you visit the ground on occasion. And the best claim is you come, you settle on the ground, you build on the ground, and you are there. So this is what they were doing. They were coming to stake a solid claim on this ground. Needless to say, there were occasional disputes about this area, as in any area when you've got claims that are as big as this, and they used to. I mean, they used to have claims that were set up. You go to this big oak tree here, to that. Well, this property was just platted in 1831, 2 years before, and this particular area did not have specific plats. So in any case, Mr. Phillips, who came in about the middle of the term, bought a property. And with that property, his neighbor happened to be Mr. Moss. They got into an argument over the boundary line of the property. And it resulted in tempers flaring, and Mr. Phillips killed Mr. Moss. Well, he was tried, he was convicted of manslaughter, but was not sent to jail because of a quirk in the Illinois law at that time. He remained in Earlville, had a large family, and was really a valued member of his community. So, but it's wilderness. Law was the man who stood up for his rights and said, "This is mine." That needed to change, obviously, along the way. So Mr. Sutphin came back from Boston, brought his wife. The child was Sarah. Arrived back in October of '34, and they built a double-wide cabin. Now, I don't know how they did that in the amount of time they did. I would have thought that would have taken a lot of time, but maybe Kurt can tell me how that works. But this cabin was set very close to where Rich Goodbread lives today, which is just south of town across the Sutphin's Run. He later built a brick house in that area that regretfully should have been preserved, but it was in such shape that they tore it down about 2 years ago, I believe. And that's the way things go. Preservation takes money, and needless to say, we're lucky, very fortunate to have this particular historical society here. And both Anna and Chris are a big supporter of this. So, who came? Well, Sutton, obviously, his wife and family. John Cook came, well, the Dow brothers, of course, McDowells. We call them Dow brothers, but they were really, I think, Irishers, and they were Albert and Warren. The two brothers that surveyed the area with him were not here, or did not stay here. They all came from Barnstable, Massachusetts. John Cook was a brother-in-law of Sutton and removed to the west to do lumber, as did Russell Bliss later. Russell Bliss apparently made a very good fortune in the lumber business out in California because that land still remains in his family's possession today. And I believe we've got a man here, I saw him come in. Who, no?
Jack?
Jack, where are you?
He's not here.
Oh, he's not here.
Okay.
Well, in any case,
Another state.
yeah, Jack Anderson is, lives on that property. He bought the 5 acres that were the house and buildings of that place. It's on route, the heart of Blacktop. So Mr. Cook came, as I said. Corrigan Doan came, and he married Hannah Johnson, and later S.T. Stilson's sister. There was a heavy death rate in this area, and mainly because I suppose the lack of sterile conditions of the water that you're drinking may or may not have been good. A lot of diarrhea, a lot of throwing up. So this was one of the major problems. Obviously, no physician in the area. We have Abram Foster that came. He had 7 children. D.A. Ballard came, and his son remained here in Earlville. And his daughters were Ellen, who married Mr. Lynn, Eliza, who married Mr. Worrell, and Martha, who married Alan McGregor. Now, Ross and Johnson's claims that we talked about earlier, when they crossed the big Indian River in finding this place, there were 2 people that were staking claims north of town, and they were Ross and Johnson. They sold their claims to McClaskey and Phillips. D.A. Ballard came and he married Sutton's wife's sister and became a partner of Sutton. John Thornton and wife Hannah Benedict came from St. Lawrence County, and they had 3 daughters. Luriana, who married Samuel Carter, Roby, who married William Immel, and Sarah, who married O.J. Wilson. As you can see, this town is becoming very interlinked through marriages, and not only through the marriages, but the fact that there were deaths along the way. You had a family, you needed a pair of people to take care of this family to survive. So it was a very short time from having a death to having a remarriage. The first marriage in the township was Oliver Johnson and Matilda Ross. Carrie Sutton was the first white child to be born in the township, and Charles Sutton was the first white male to be born. James Phillips came and purchased property and killed his neighbor, which we talked about. The Carter family has been here for years. They're still here, and I would like to have the Earl talk a little bit about the relationship from the start of the Carter family down to today. Can you give her the microphone? Just stay there, Will.
Dale, let's turn yours off, maybe that.
Test it. You hear me? Am I close enough? Yep. Yeah, there you go. There were 2 Joel Carters, which makes it kind of confusing. But I think they came from New York, and Samuel Carter was the one that's up here, and his son's name was Joel, who was Bruce's grandfather, and he was in the Civil War. In fact, the picture of the World War I veterans and the Civil War veterans, I believe is upstairs with the rest of the military things, and he's pictured in that with the Civil War veterans. was injured in the war, shot in the mouth in the battle of, I forgot now, thought about it at home, and was honorably discharged and came back here to live. And I think it was Samuel and his sons that had the mill that was directly below the northwest corner of Precinct Cemetery. The stones from that are at the entrance down. And his son was Joel's son. Was he had 3 sons. It was Louis, Clyde, and Mark, who was my father-in-law. And then down to Bruce, Forrest Carter, Bruce, and Howard Carter. And my son Harold Carter, I think, is the only one with that name here in this area now. At one time, there were 3 of them on Harding Blacktop. Forrest and Craig and Harold, but now it's just him left. I don't know.
Okay,
I guess that's
well,
about
thank you.
it.
That's nice. A nice rendition of the Carters.
Turn your mic back on then.
As if you can't hear me.
Thank you.
I've got Joel Carter, and maybe you can tell me, Earl, if this is the right one. He had sons Samuel, Alonzo, Levi, Benjamin, Foster, Uriel, Ferdinand. Is that the family?
That was the first Joel.
You're right, okay. They obviously still live in the area, and Bruce and Earl were big supporters of this particular society. Samuel Carter, there were other Carters that came. Samuel Carter had a wife that was Luriana. Now, is that in the family?
Yes. That
Okay.
That was Joel's parents.
Okay, well, they came at the year before Joel came. The next person that came was William Immel, and he was married to Roby Thornton. They had 7 children. 1 died here, and George remained here. And Stan Malloy has some background of the Immels.
Turn your mic on.
I didn't know.
Good morning.
Go ahead and stand up.
I'm going to have a little look into the family of William Immel. Does this work?
Yeah,
You have to
just a
hold
little
it
bit
closer to your
closer.
mouth.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. The beginning of the Immel family in LaSalle County started with the birth of William Immel in Wayne County, Indiana, to George W. and Elizabeth Durham Immel in 1815. He came to Illinois and located near Munsontown by Harding in 1835. He was able to obtain 176 acres from the homestead program by laying claim and building a shelter on the property. William married Roby Thornton at Munsontown in 1837. They had 9 children. Roby was born in New York. William is one of the oldest settlers in the area and served as a school director. Roby preceded William in death in 1900. 2 of their children also died before William. His funeral was held at the Methodist Church by Reverend W.J. Abel and burial at the Carter Cemetery in 1903. He lived to the age of 87 and was of clear mind to the end. George Washington Immel, we're going to jump ahead there a little bit. George Washington Immel was born to Julia Love Williams in 1875, and they had 4 children. His second wife was Lucy Jelina McHenry, and they married in 1881. They had 6 children, with the youngest being Roy Immel, who is grandfather to many Immel families in the Earlville area.
Stan, say how what your connection is, your Malloy collection.
Yeah. my mother was an Emil. So that's what our connection is.
Clifford
Okay,
was
very good.
his
Thank
mother's
you.
brother, and Clifford's son, Larry, my son.
Oh, yeah, right.
Well, that was interesting. I had no background on the Emmels at all, and so that was excellent. In 1836, John, they always called him O.J. Wilson, but his name was Osmond John. Apparently he didn't like Osmond, so he was O.J. Had 7 sons, 2 daughters. In 37, Major Wallace came. Not a military major, that was his name, Major. Came from Vermont. He was a physician, lived here 10 years. They needed a physician. His sons were Charles Wallace, who married Widow Scott. And Charles Wallace and Widow Scott ran the Wallace House, which is the building right on the corner, which was the hotel and for this area after things got going. Their son was George Wallace, and he married Miss White. Other people that came that I don't have much information on were Frank Randstad, April Husford, and James Phillips. Russell Bliss came in 37. He has a large land out at the lower southeast corner of the township, and which circles where I live. And as I said, it's been in the family for years and is still in the family. Bliss was a businessman. He opened a store attached to his home and went on to sell that to his, I believe it was his son-in-law, and ended up going to California in the lumber business, where he did obviously very well. There were many closenesses, obviously, as you look at it, and the reason we're going through the families like this is it becomes a very close-knit community. As Earl said, your 2 families were together. Many other families were the same way. Somebody married somebody and you became literally a cousin. One of the things about the deaths here is I would imagine that childbirth was a major problem back then as far as deaths. On the other hand, we have a lot of widows that are married, so it wasn't just childbirth, it was across the board. In 1838, Allen Brown came from Berkshire, Massachusetts. He was married to Sarah Williams Burton, and he arrived with 5 children. Mary Jane married Alonzo Benamy. Lucy married William Pateman. Frances married William Ballard. Maria married Jerome Snyder. And Dwight married Celestia Agnew. Now, Allen Brown purchased all of the land that was east of Main Street being where the post office is, and north of Brown Street, or what is now Brown Street. And it bears his name. Carol Stockley has some information on that for us.
Dale.
There, got it.
Thank you.
Can you hear it? Okay. All right, you were talking about the people that came from Cherry Valley, New York, is that correct? Yeah, okay. And Charles was a member of the Union Army during the Civil War. He was a prisoner at Andersonville Prison, where he nearly starved to death. And they had contacted, according to the stories that I heard, they had contacted the family to come claim the body, and when they did, he wiggled his finger, and they realized he was alive. He was very starving to death before his release. So they brought him back to Ottawa, and he was in the Harding area after that, after being in Ottawa. He married Annie Butters of Freedom Township, and they had 4 children, including William Herbert Stockley, and that's where the Stockley family comes into it. I do have a list here that tells there were 5 generations from the Brown family, and there's a picture, and when Ethel Stockley, I don't know exactly here what happened. I'm looking at it. There was 5 generations anyhow, and they had a picture, and none of them looked very happy, but they, I don't know why no one smiled when they had pictures.
They never did.
Yeah, I think it was quite a process. So, some of the lineage that I have on this paper shows that Williams Burt married Lucy Bowen, and this will tell how they moved on. Sarah Burt married Alan Brown. Sarah Jane Brown married Alonzo Von Amy. Eva Irene Von Amy married Andrew Blue. Andrew Blue, Ethel married, Ethel Felina Blue married William Herbert Stockley. And then William Herbert Stockley they had 9 children in their family. And my father, William Russell Stockley, was one of the ancestors of that union. So, and I do have a picture, but you don't have that, do you, Dale, on your presentation?
We don't have the picture.
No.
Yeah.
The picture is involved that she's talking about has 5 generations of women all living here in this town, and it went from Sarah Brown to Vanamy, to Blue,
Right.
to Stockley, to the first Stockley child, who was Gladys Stockley. She was born in 1898. So,
Okay.
thank you. Back on. Several of the other people that came were the Smiths, Daniel and David Smith. David married Harriet Burt. It's Williams Burt's daughter. Williams is an odd name. It wasn't just William, it has an S on the end of it. Very easy to trace, because you don't find many Williams as a first name. As my uncle always said, many of you knew Uncle Herbert, he said, well, you can choose your friends, but you can't pick your relatives. Well, that's true. And with genealogy, if you've delved into it much, you will find that you have to take the bad and the ugly with the good. And on November 9th in 1852, Williams Burt was sitting on this street somewhere imbibing a little bit too much alcohol at a bar. And the only thing I could hope was the bar that was serving bad liquor and he was ill rather than drunk, but who knows. He got on his horse to ride home. It was partway out of Mountain Street, or path at that point, when he fell off his horse. He crawled about 100 yards and lay there and froze to death. And that was in the newspaper. They didn't pull any punches in the newspapers back then. That was rather interesting, I thought. So you can take the good, bad, and the ugly. From South Adams, Math, John Currier came, James Wood came, Samuel Talbert Stilson came. They called him Sam. Came from Chautauqua County in New York. He was a successful farmer, merchant, grain dealer, and banker. Stilson built the Fuller house south of Dodge Park. Now that house is still there?
Yes.
My understanding. It's that old house. I thought they were going to tear it down years ago. It had been a rooming house. It's still there. Mr. Stilson gave the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Universalists lots for their churches. Well, the Presbyterians at that point, where the Presbyterian church is, used to be the old seminary, the school. That, in turn, got blown up once they came into the bar that was serving bad liquor, and they trashed the place, threw all the liquor out. He, in turn, decided that he was going to get even, and hired a man to blow up the brand new school, which he did. So at that point, the Presbyterians ended up with that corner lot. The Methodists are blocked to the west, and Universalists are where we'd all know, or I know, is where Bob Strong's house was. I don't know who lives in that now.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, well, in any case, yeah, that's good enough.
McWade.
Yeah, McQuaid's.
Okay, that's good enough. But and then that was a beautiful old home. It is a beautiful old home.
The bricks from that home came from the Universalist
Came
Church.
from the church, yeah. Sam Stolson arrived here in '39, again from Chautauqua. Well, I already said that. And he set up a second store, later sold it to James Wood, his father-in-law. Have you ever wondered why there's not a United Town Center in Earlville? You know, many of these towns you go in, there's the bank, there's the church, there's the governmental center, but they're all within an area. Not in this town. And the reason is the railroad. The town center was supposed to be down at Union and Ottawa Street. And that's where it was all beginning to set up as. Well, as soon as the railroad came, all the businessmen looked around and said, we don't want to be down here away from the railroad. Some of them actually moved buildings, others moved their business, and ended up on Railroad Street, which kind of left this area as a split community for churches and business. And actually, that's right. The business all ended up down here. Churches were ended up down there. But the railroad came to town, it reorganized the town, destroyed what would have been the town center, and it all moved north. Now we have a man that came to town who was a mover and a shaker, and his name was Sutton. And he purchased 1,000 acres with D.A. Ballard. And this is beyond what he had staked as a claim. And Sutton, in the meantime, you may or may not know, was the postmaster. He started the first precinct to come and vote here. And by the way, does anybody know what the precinct name was?
Indian.
Indian. You're right. It was the Indian precinct. That's very good. That's a rare person would know that.
We have a rare person right here.
Yeah. And in any case, and he sat as a commissioner for 14 years. He bought this land, this 1,000 acres, on a 3-year term. The 3-year term was that he was to pay off in so much each year. He paid $1,100 for it, and he got the money from a local banker, not a local banker, it was over in Peru. And he made the first payment, fine, he was ready to make the second payment, and the man died. Well, it went into an estate. Well, then the people that were his children said, oh, that's our land, it's in his name. Well, the reason it was in his name was because of the usury laws. He wanted 50% interest. They talked him down to 30% interest, but still way above the fair interest rates. So in any case, Sutton immediately filed in the court, and after a year it was decided that even though he knew it was a usurious deal he entered into, that the land was really his, not the children's or heirs, and so he ended up with that 1,000 acres. Of that 1,000 acres, he sold 400 to Sam Stilson. And Sam, in turn, sold the northern portion of that to Matthias Signer, who arrived in 1853. Now, Signer built the best block house in the area and added a frame to it where he kept a boarding house. He opened a grain business with H.A. Chase and served as an agent for the new railroad that came into town. Then he became involved in the stock trade, then he opened a coal and tile company. This man helped the town grow. The tile company, if you may not know, is where the golf course is today. A lot of the area that has been excavated out below ground there on number one. The man who built the railroad, or was the engineer, was another major player in this town, and his name was William Haight. And he was of Scottish ancestry, and he was in charge of laying the track from Leland to Mendota. And on coming to Earlville, he worked for the Chicago and Galena Union Railroad. He went into business with, he settled here, went into business with Sam Stilson, erected a grain elevator, conducted a general merchandise store, and organized a bank that was named the Exchange Bank. Now this lasted for about 20 years, but apparently, I don't know what happened at that point, but it closed. And he opened a second bank that was the First National Bank of Earlville. He served as its president, and that was in the 1880s. He served as its president, and William Whitaker served as his vice president. Now, William Whitaker is my third great-grandfather. Haight served 2 terms as township supervisor, and after that, William Whitaker served 3 terms as township supervisor. Whitaker owned 400 lands south of town where I live today. Something in closing said my wife died, and then that was about in 1880, and I courted and married my cousin's widow who lived in Joliet. I'd known her all my life, and we got married. And I ended up living in Joliet, and so I sold my land to William Robinson. William Robinson is another name that you would, if you're local here, know of Robinson Hall. He built that building on the south, on the north side of the corner above, the car wash and that area there. It was a big hall. I've been up in it as a child. It's no longer there. He built other buildings on the south side of the street. And he was known as Uncle Willie. And Uncle Willie was apparently a very likable man. I've got a picture of him. I didn't get it too into the area because of my illness, but he's just a little, looks like a very likable little man.
Jack Robinson's father?
What?
Was his son Jack?
I think so, yeah. And well, Jack Robinson ended up being the pharmacist here in town, and I grew up on Jack Robinson's farm north of Earlville. For 25 years, Dad farmed that farm. And then when he died, Jack died, his son, or his nephew, I guess, decided he was going to farm. Well, he never farmed before, so that didn't last long. But, and I believe it's ended up with, oh, I can't think of the name now. You remember the name of, no, okay. Yeah, I keep looking for it. All right. In any case, he sold it to William Robinson. When my wife died, Elizabeth, I sold all my property to William H. Robinson. This included 196 acres west of Ottawa Street and 46 acres east of Ottawa Street, which runs by our front door. We have all heard of the Robinson name, and there are several floors that were built in there. When they had second floors, they had meetings. The DuPays had a hall that was also in their building. And that basically is the sum and substance up to the form of the foundation of Earlville, and I didn't want to get into the foundation of Earlville, not tonight, or today. Thank you very much. I apologize for sitting down and making this presentation.
Dale, you were going to mention how we got the name Earlville.
Earlville is it's a question. The one rendition says that Mrs. Sutton, which was Elizabeth Houghton McDowell, had a nephew that was named Earl, and that they wanted to name it after him. The other rendition is when you find out where the Sutphens lived in the New York area. Later on, it was called Earlville. So I would almost say that the first had a lot more to it than, or the second story is much more reliable than that it was named after a nephew. But it could have been both.
She's got a couple slides that you had us put in here you might just want to talk about.
Okay, what do we got there?
Presbyterian Church.
I think you were talking about the Presbyterian Church.
Oh,
and
yes, okay.
that's where the school was at.
Yeah, and look behind it, and you see where they had the shed for the horses, you can drive the horses in. Well, that was there when the school was there too, and a place to put some rigs. Because these people would come in from the farm, and they'd have to have a place to shelter your animal.
That building is now our sanctuary.
Yes,
That's been added to.
yeah, and it's added on this side, right? Yeah. You got another picture?
Is that at across from Casey's or where is that?
Yeah.
Kitty corner across from Casey's.
Right. This is the map of Earlville, and I don't see, is this the one where we have the names of the owners or not?
Yeah, a lot of the divisions are like the Stilson, what Stilson owned and what Hapeman owned and all of the people you've been talking about. So if you like go and get your abstract of your property, a lot of those names are still listed on there as the initial ground.
Yeah, what I liked about that is this area down here, this little circle down here at the bottom is Sutphen's Run. There was a mill down there, and it lists that there's a mill there. This is Ottawa Street going up. This is a Presbyterian church. This is a big building that was there, and it's where the Catholics initially started to meet. This is where the school was put, and obviously later we had the big school there, the big school over here. This school disappeared, as did the gym. That's all housing now, and the school is all over in this area. Sutphen owned this area. He sold to Signor, who owned up in this area, and I believe the last person, what did you say his name was, owned over here?
I know there's a Mary Jane Mosley that owns where Grant Street is at, or that's considered the Mary Jane Mosley division.
She had a hunk of land that was on the east end, and it was pasture, and that turned into a street or into a farm. The land, the houses ended at the Lutheran church. Then it was kind of open land. From there on, it got developed. But yes, that was Mary Ann's property. Any questions? Anybody want to take this mic and give us a rendition? Earl.
Well, I thought that where Bruce's grandfather was injured, the Battle of Shiloh.
Okay, Battle of Shiloh. Yeah. Well, my grandfather, I don't remember where he was. I did know, but where he was captured. And he always said that if he'd known what he'd had to go through by 3 months in Andersonville, he'd have fought a lot harder not to be captured. Because Andersonville was a pit. I visited it. It's in Georgia. It was a prison that was built for 10,000 people that had 30,000 in it. So it was a mess. They had a 5-acre, what they called a kill zone around the fence they were inside of. You stepped into the kill zone, they'd shoot you. No questions. So it was not a nice place, without a doubt.
Any questions for Dale?
The owner of Mr. Sutphen's property, any questions? Okay.
Thank you very much, Dale. I appreciate it.
That's all right.